we've passed the point of being dangerous, but we can still deal with the situation if we begin to make fossil fuels pay their cost to society, and do that in a way which can be made global. And the United States should be the leader. We are by far the most responsible for the situation we're in.
Welcome to the Climate Emergency Forum. Today we have some very special guests, and we'll be discussing a petition to phase out greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm here with Dan Galpern from the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, who's going to explain to us a bit more about this petition and what we can expect going forward. Dan, can you share with us an update of what's happening?
Okay, well, specifically what is happening here today is that we are doing a press briefing. This is a press briefing before we file this petition that you just talked about, Regina. The petition is to the Environmental Protection Agency under the Toxic Substances Control Act and other US federal law. And it demands a phase out of certain chemical substances and mixtures. They are greenhouse gas emissions, including legacy greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels. And these, the petitioners note, are presenting a risk of injury to health or the environment, and therefore that is in conflict
with Section 6 of the Toxic Substances Control Act.
So citizens have the right to petition the agency to undertake rulemaking. And the specific action that we seek for EPA to take at this juncture is that it needs to render a determination. Do these chemical substances and mixtures present a risk of injury to health and the environment or not? So that's at the heart of this petition. The petition goes further and documents the relevant, or outlines at least the relevant scientific evidence, and presents to the agency what we think a reasonable rule would look like. So in any event, we are intending to file this coming Thursday, June 16, and to hold a press conference after that. But in order to provide some background information to interested media, the Climate Emergency Forum has kindly agreed to host this press availability, this press background briefing. So we appreciate being here. Now, this is not just a petition by the organization that I work for. And I should also say that I'm a long time and continuing attorney to the climate scientist, James Hansen. The specific petitioners themselves, the individual petitioners, are Dr. James Hansen, Donn Viviani, a 35-year veteran of EPA, John Birx, who is a professor emeritus in atmospheric chemistry from the University of Colorado, Richard Heedy, who happens to be the director of the Climate Accountability Institute, but is a petitioner here in his own capacity, and Lisa Van Susteren, who is a physician, a practicing psychiatrist, and a clinical professor in psychiatry in Washington, D.C. They are joined as petitioners by Climate Science Awareness and Solutions, which is a program that Dr. Hansen directs at Columbia University's Earth Institute and Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative. With that, if we could, I would like to open it to questions from our colleagues in the media who have come here for this specific purpose.
So I'm just very curious why you decided to approach this under TOSCA versus any other law. And you said it does touch on other US federal laws. Can you name those?
Certainly. I can take this, but others can join in as well. The reason for proceeding under the Toxic Substances Control Act is because it's very strong, pointed language that if you actually have a chemical substance or mixture, such as here, greenhouse gas emissions that derive predominantly from fossil fuels, the agency actually has the authority where those are presenting a risk of injury to health or the environment to impose a series of requirements, actually to the point of prohibition. And that has to do with requirements to the point of prohibition with respect to their production, with respect to their importation, with respect to processing or distribution or commerce or use, or even disposal. And of course, how do we dispose traditionally of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, we just let it into the air, into the atmosphere, as if it's a free and open sewer. And so the reason for proceeding under TOSCA is because it provides a very strong tool, a firm legal foundation for a wide-ranging decarbonization program if we choose to utilize the authority that's contained in it. TOSCA also directs that EPA should utilize other authorities within its control, or even refer to other agencies where they retain substantial authority to proceed. And so in this petition, we also seek EPA's strongest action under other relevant portions of the Clean Air Act, of a little-known statute passed in 1956 by Congress called the Independent Offices Appropriations Act, which would be useful for additional support for EPA to impose a rising carbon fee on oil, coal, and gas, and a few other statutes. They are all contained in our petition.
Sorry, Dan, that's exactly right. Thank you. The other thing is that this sort of problem is exactly the thing that TOSCA was designed for. Congress knew that there were problems out there that were multimedia, multi-program, that a single media act couldn't handle, and that we needed something more expansive. It was designed to take care of things that the other laws weren't properly taking care of. And if you look back at the history of climate, it's quite clear that none of the other laws are taking care of this. So this is exactly what TOSCA was designed to do.
Actually, Don, I'd like to just add to your addition as well, to note an important point that we make, perhaps only just in a footnote in the petition. But TOSCA actually was used in 1978 for just this purpose with respect to CFCs, on the ground in the rule that CFCs were endangering the ozone layer and presented a serious risk with respect to global warming. CFCs are also a gas, and therefore, there actually is strong precedent in EPA's own actions in utilizing this statute to kickstart an effort to get rid of that potent pollutant that has very strong greenhouse gas forcing effect as well.
Isn't it true, Dan, that TOSCA has a provision in it that allows people like us to petition the EPA also, and that's another reason I think that we're doing this.
Yes, that's right.
Under Section 21.
So we are proceeding in this petition
Predominantly under Section 21 of the Toxic Substances Control Act,
which allows citizens to petition for the commencement of a rulemaking by the agency. And then when they do that, the agency has 90 days to act. So our filing on June 16 will kick off a 90-day window in which EPA will be considering this, and in which people have the opportunity to submit public comments. And we certainly hope that a number of interested citizens and organizations will submit supportive comments. Once they determine, and it's very hard to conceive of the agency making a wrong decision here, that greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuels endanger health, present a risk of injury to health and the environment, then they commence a rulemaking. And in that rulemaking, all interests will have the ability to convey their thoughts about what a rule would look like that is necessary to actually eliminate the risk from these chemical substances and mixtures.
Dan, could I ask a question about kind of the legal context within which this is playing out? So, you know, obviously there's this major decisions litigation going on before the Supreme Court right now. And I'm just wondering, you know, whether or not that's germane to the petition and how that might all play out.
Yeah, good question, Frank. Specifically, the litigation that you're talking about is West Virginia versus the Environmental Protection Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be decided within this month, I believe. I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule, but traditionally, the court finishes up all its cases by the end of June, sometimes into the first few days of July, but rarely. And it often saves its most controversial decisions for the end. In any event, the specific issue there is whether a specific provision of the Clean Air Act was properly interpreted by the Obama administration in its formulation of the prior Clean Power Plan. And I've written a little bit about this in a blog that was posted a couple of weeks ago on our website if you're interested in more detail, but they're attempting to interpret some language that is not a model of clarity under Section 111D concerning whether the agency has the authority to impose restrictions on power plant emissions that stem from outside any particular power plant's boundaries. That's the specific issue. And whether in doing so, EPA violated this doctrine that is not long established in law, in which at least some members of the Supreme Court have said that without express authorization by Congress, the agency or any agency should not take action that raises major questions concerning industrial activity in the United States. But the scope of that doctrine, the extent to which it applies even to that case, is unclear. And so it all depends on the level of generality with which the Supreme Court approaches the question in that issue, whether it will have any implication outside the bounds of that particular case. Of course, those who have sought to bring that case to the Supreme Court, conservative states that are heavily influenced by the coal industry in particular, are seeking a very, very wide, very general, wide-ranging application of that doctrine. So we will see what happens there. But in any event, we're not proceeding under that section of the Clean Air Act. In fact, we're not proceeding under any section of the Clean Air Act, whatever. And in my own view, I think that EPA properly interpreted Section 111D in its formulation of the Clean Power Plan. And this, this is without respect to whether the Clean Power Plan went far enough. I believe it only scratched the surface of what's needed. But I think that the agency was due deference in its construction of that provision of the statute, and its utilization of it to ground its construction of the Clean Power Plan. But here, proceeding under Section 6, predominantly, of the Toxic Substances Control Act. And whatever ambiguity may have infected that section of the Clean Air Act to cause this level of litigation over it, Section 6 of the Toxic Substances Control Act does not suffer from any similar ambiguity. Put more simply, the language is crystal clear. Where there are chemical substances or mixtures that present a risk of injury to health or the environment, the agency is supposed to act. And the Congress delineated a full gamut of requirements from mild to tough and instructed the agency to take that action that is necessary, that's minimally required to ensure that the risk is eliminated. So in my own view, even if the Supreme Court rules expansively in West Virginia versus the United States, our petition should be able to go forward unimpeded.
Thank you.
And if I can add one more thing to that, they just reauthorized the act in 2016. And it was a bipartisan reauthorization. So clearly, this is the language that TSCA is supposed to deal with unreasonable risk is recent, and it was a bipartisan passage.
And those amendments strengthened TSCA from our perspective with respect to this petition.
May I add that it was said without regard to cost.
That's right. The Congress made clear in 2016 that the determination as to whether some chemical substances or mixtures present a risk of injury to health and the environment, that determination needs to be made without respect to cost or other non-risk factors. And so from our view, TSCA is a much stronger statute on which to base this kind of rulemaking.
As somebody ignorant to the policymaking process on that side of things, I'd pull on that thread a little bit and just ask, how is the reasonability of risk determined? Who determines it? And what are the criteria involved in making that determination?
Well, it's not specified in detail in the statute, except that Congress has clarified that the initial determination needs to be made without respect to cost or non-risk factors. So do they or do they not present a risk to health or the environment? Here, of course, we have both. It's overwhelming. And we spend 75 pages in part 2 of the petition delineating how. And then once, though, they commence rulemaking, they can consider the full range of tools that are available under the Toxic Substances Control Act or any other authority to do what's necessary to eliminate the risk. And there they can consider costs, and they should, but a consideration of cost of a particular type of regulation, be it the imposition of a rising fee on carbon emissions, for example, or a required phase out of production of fossil fuels, however they choose to proceed, the set of requirements needs to be deemed sufficient to eliminate the risk.
Whether or not a risk is unreasonable is a value judgment, and value judgments, according to OMB and according to another statute, are inherently governmental. So as petitioners, we can't tell the agency that something is unreasonable. All we can do is basically state the obvious, that this is an existential risk we're faced with, and it's an avoidable existential risk, and avoidable existential risk can't be reasonable, and that's all we can do. And then it's up to them to make that decision. And I think what you do is you kind of look at other risks that they, under TSCA, they thought were unreasonable, and it's things like cutting fluid and formaldehyde, and these are much more contained risks, much smaller risks, and yet they thought those were unreasonable. So clearly this is equally or much more unreasonable.
Can I add to this point? The harm to people and the environment is clearly greatly accelerating, year to year. If you look at sort of extreme weather events, or if you look at methane coming up from the Arctic, loss of Arctic sea ice, glacial collapse in Antarctica and Greenland, these are things that Dr. Hansen's been talking about forever. I mean, he testified to Congress about the risks from climate change, and clearly, it's not a linear process. The risks are getting higher and higher from year to year, and they're going to hit global food supply, for example, soon. Things like that. They're very severe, dangerous risks. So, does the petition try to emphasize that point to the EPA? Because I would argue that if the EPA understood the true nature of these risks that we're all facing from rapid or abrupt climate change occurring, they would be doing these actions on their own. They wouldn't be requiring petitions and things like that. Like, I thought that would have been their job. So, I mean, do you talk about the accelerating harms and risks in the petition at all, Dan?
Yes, we do. And part 2 of the petition, it would take thousands of pages to do it justice, but we spend 75 pages talking about the risks from global warming and from ocean acidification. We rely on Dr. Hansen's work, and we also summarize some sections of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's work, including their recent publications of 2021. So yes, indeed, we do talk about that.
So do you think the EPA is aware? Like what's going on within? Are they just ignoring this information? I mean, everybody has it, right? You've got 75 pages. They could look at the latest IPCC reports. They can, look at the increase of extreme weather events around the world, floods and droughts, and everything happening. Like, why can't they take action without petitions?
Paul, I was actually director of climate policy assessment division for a while in the 90s. EPA is well aware of all of these things, and they're worried about it, and all the staff is running around wishing that they could do something. The problem is they felt that they didn't have the authority, and that none of the laws gave them the authority. In fact, the authority has been hiding in plain sight the entire time under the Toxic Substances Act. But there was sort of a perceived wisdom that the Toxic Substances Control Act didn't work, based on how the agency got hammered over asbestos and it was actually the agency's fault, because they didn't do their due diligence. But they thought they had a slam dunk there. It didn't work. They kind of threw up their hands and say, we have to work under the Clean Air Act, which is an abysmal law, and they felt they had no choice. But
yeah, wanted to return to the issue of an unreasonable risk of injury and look at the standards in the legal system already in place that you may be able to shed light on. But we know that the standards typically are more likely than not is one standard. And then, of course, in criminal actions, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. And we certainly meet both of those. And then the third standard is a reasonable person would be affected by something. That's another standard that I certainly see in my forensic work. So we certainly have more than satisfied all 3 of those legal precedents.
Well, Paul, is that sufficient for answers to your question?
Yeah, yes. And
okay.
I don't know if Dr. Hansen wants to add anything about, how quickly, the consequences of climate change are accelerating.
Well, it's not only how quickly we see consequences occurring, but the fact that we are banking much greater consequences for young people and their children. That's the issue which characterizes this problem, because of the slow response of the climate system. The great thermal inertia of the ocean, and the fact that ice sheets don't respond quickly. But once you start them responding, they can be out of your control. So there's an enormous danger that we will hand our children a situation that is out of their control. And that danger has grown enormously over the past few decades. When it became clear that we should do something decades ago, but we haven't. in fact, emissions have just continued to increase. And even today, people think that the government must be doing something. They talk about it a lot. But in fact, the emissions are accelerating. Methane, nitrous oxide, CO2 is not quite at its peak rate because we're in a La Nina. But with the next El Nino, it's going to set records for the rate of growth. And what we have to do is actually get it to decline. So we're so far off, and that just hasn't sunk in. And even though we have international organization, the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the conferences of the parties, some of the stuff that they're coming out with is pretty nonsensical. The last COP, the head said, well, we've kept within the possibility to stay under 1.5 degrees warming. That's absolute bullshit. There's too much inertia in the energy system and in the warming that's in the pipeline. Just because the planet is now out of balance by an enormous amount. Doesn't sound like much, a little more than 1 watt per meter squared, but that contains more than 1 degree Celsius additional warming. And we're already at 1.2. So yeah, we've passed the point of being dangerous, but we can still deal with the situation if we begin to make fossil fuels pay their cost to society, and do that in a way which can be made global. And the United States should be the leader. We are by far the most responsible for the situation we're in, both on an absolute basis and even more so on a per capita basis. And we're derelict in not fessing up to that responsibility. And the government is not doing that now, even though they claim, oh, we're going to reduce emissions 50%. Well, that's, you've got to do it in a way that can be made global. And we have to recognize our global responsibility, and we're not doing that. But this, if we succeed in this action, that will be a major step in the right direction, because the fundamental fact is you've got to make the price of the fossil fuels include their cost to society. And this would give you the chance to move in that direction.
Yes, thank you. And just a last point, NOAA is saying that the probability of passing 1.5 is about 50% within the next 5 years. And I'm pretty sure that study is just saying, well, the chance of an El Nino in the next 5 years is 50%, right? Because that can push us to 0.2 or 0.3 degrees over. And we're near the top temperature records. We're in the top 10, even though we have an ongoing powerful La Nina cooling things off. We're still in the top 10 globally. So yeah, it's you know, I always think something's going to happen globally where people suddenly wake up, but it hasn't happened yet, that's for sure. You know, a tipping point in human understanding of the risks or human behavior on climate, but it hasn't happened yet. But we've got to keep trying.
Well, let me jump in here. This is Rick. 30 years ago, the U.S. signed on to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we committed to take the lead on addressing climate change on the basis of our differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And George Herbert Bush publicly said that greenhouse effect hasn't met the White House effect yet. I think he said that around 1992 or 93. And I agree with Jim that policy has failed. Science to some degree has failed in making its message as broad and as publicly available as possible. National Academy of Sciences and other academics and government researchers have issued reports and warnings since the 1950s. You might even go back to the early 1890s with Arrhenius's work on climate change and CO2 carbonic acid pollution to understand that the basic physics has long been known, that we have appreciated that growth in fossil fuel use would threaten severe harm to the planet and its population and the biosphere. And we've continued to ignore it, in part because industry itself, the incumbent industry, has a profit motive to continue its business. And it's not as though we need massive amounts of fossil fuels. What humans need is the product and the outcome of using fuels. But there are alternatives. There's hydropower, there's electricity for transportation. We can reduce our emissions dramatically and by and large save money in the bargain. But politicians and members of Congress have been lobbied heavily. The oil and gas industry in particular has invested hundreds of millions of dollars over time in disinformation to the public, lobbied Congress against prospective legislation that would deal with the problem. And so we've known about the issue, but we have failed to address it. And we can't wait for the most dire consequences that Jim alluded to before we take action. So we have hope in this EPA petition that the EPA will take this seriously. It'll be a huge step forward.
I'd like to thank you very much, everybody. I'd like to circle back to Dawn, who had a question, if she still remembers it.
Yeah, no, I do. Thank you. I was looking at the petition and I'm just curious. We don't have access to the whole thing. So can you just give us an idea of the rulemakings that you're suggesting? So it says like phase out, phase in, GHG emissions fee, legacy and residual emissions, just big picture, what you're thinking?
We don't have a blueprint for exactly how that rulemaking should go. But we think that there are certain tools that can be phased in very quickly. One could have, under the authority of the Toxic Substance Control Act and the other statute that I talked about, the Independent Officers Appropriation Act, a phase-in of a rising carbon fee. Now that also would need to be a parallel rulemaking, and so there would need to be notice and comment on it. In the petition, we note that a rising carbon fee has been analyzed by economists, including even, for example, the International Monetary Fund, to be a very efficient and effective tool for efficiently phasing out CO2 emissions in particular, and some of the other greenhouse gases as well, including, for example, methane, to the extent that we're talking about methane emissions from fossil fuels. And so that's one thing that it can do. A second thing it can do is impose a set of restrictions and prohibitions on emissions, and so it could, it could have more than just the fee on emissions and on fossil fuels, the major source of most of our greenhouse gas emissions. And in addition, EPA, under the authority of the Toxic Substance Control Act, could impose either requirements for industry to remove residual emissions, or could impose a requirement that they pay into a fund, which we call the Atmospheric Carbon Abatement Fund, for want of a better term, to ensure that it will be done. And we propose that initially fossil fuel industry would be responsible for 50% to remove 50% of their so-called legacy emissions, stemming from the point that Rick Heady identified in 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed and then ratified by the United States Senate. And then the obligation would grow in ensuing years. So 51% of the emissions that that they're responsible for would be required to be removed for the year 2023 or the first year after the rule, and on up the scale until sometime after the turn of the century, the fossil fuel industry would need to be removing 100% of its emissions by that time. In any event, so those are the two basic parts that we see. One is a set of requirements to phase out greenhouse gas emissions, and the second is to compel removal of a substantial share of the excess of emissions that the fossil fuel industry within the reach of United States law can require.
And may I say, monetize its removal, get ingenious types who can figure out new ways to remove it, even though they weren't responsible for emitting it.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of research that's underway now that's been paid for largely or substantially by U.S. taxpayers, including through the Infrastructure Act and previous appropriations in Congress, into methods of carbon capture and sequestration and carbon dioxide removal. There's been some significant research done in the area of methane removal. This research will continue. This research also actually could be paid for by fees imposed on the industry itself under our petition to ensure that that research is done and that field trials are put into effect.
If I could expand just a little bit on what Lisa and Dan said, there's a lot of orphan emissions that are in search of a regulation, like CAFOs and leaking abandoned mines that could then be regulated under TOSCA, and right now don't have any authority that could be regulated under. Also, Section 9 of TOSCA says that if there's a more efficient way to control a problem, that's a problem under TOSCA, that through another agency that the administrator can in fact refer that problem to these other agencies. Other agencies have an enormous amount of money in grants that they give out all the time, and we can certainly ask them to use those grants. For example, their construction grants to make sure that when you build something, it's built in a green way, that green cement is used, that the amount of CO2 that's released in the construction is less. We own a lot of rights of ways of highways. We could certainly manage those rights of ways so that they sequester carbon. So there's lots of things that the agency can do by asking other agencies to do things to reduce climate change. And I think the last thing is, as far as fees are concerned, the United States has enormous market power because we're the largest market in the world, and TOSCA has a provision that says that if something is imported into this country and it's produced in violation of a section of TOSCA, then it can be seized, or there could be restrictions put on it by the customs, by the U.S. Customs. So if we can then tax the embedded carbon that's in products that come into our shores. So it's sort of like what the Europeans do right now, but we would sort of expand it, and it would have an enormous impact on, I think, on China and other folks who make stuff for us, to make sure that when they're producing it, they either pay for the carbon that's emitted, or they use other means of producing that don't release CO2.
And Donn, do you want to talk about just for a second also about the halogenated gases that are in appliances and so on as well?
Yeah, there's about 57 gigatons of carbon equivalents that are rotting away in landfills, and more appliances are being thrown away every day. So we're increasing this bank. And in fact, even some of the ones that are not allowed to be produced, they're still being produced in China, and there are some that aren't being phased out until 2030. So we could actually have a program under TSCA where we could pay folks or manufacturers of these things could pay folks to go in and destroy these CFCs that are eventually going to be released before they're released from these disposed appliances.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
And just on that, to expand on that point, so as I think I noted,
Section 6 of TOSCA
allows authorizes the agency not only to regulate the production and the imports that Don was just talking about, and the distribution and the use of chemical substances and mixtures, but also their disposal. Because of the long-lived nature of atmospheric CO2, for example, when Exxon disposes of or is responsible for the disposal in the atmosphere, because it's placing its product into the stream of commerce with the knowledge and the intent that it will be burned and then emitted to the atmosphere, that's in effect a continuing disposal. So too is the disposal of appliances in landfills, for example. And so I believe that under TSCA, the same provision under this petition, EPA could take quite rapid action against those, very high climate forcing chemicals that are, as Don said, chemicals in search of a regulation.
And US methane emissions have hardly moved since 1990. They're somewhat lower, but we have a lot of work to do to reduce methane emissions.
That's right.
Well, I mean, part of the methane emission increase is, of course, from the fracking for, natural gas is basically 90% plus methane. And what happened with the fossil fuel company actually really pushed methane as being a bridge fuel. And of course, it turns out that because of the huge global warming potential of methane compared to CO2, that a leak rate, anything larger than about 3–4% of methane leak rates, makes methane just as bad as coal in terms of the climate impact because of the huge global warming potential. And now there's a lot of talk about the fossil fuel industry looking at creating a hydrogen economy using fossil fuels, breaking them down, extracting the hydrogen, for example. So I don't know if that's thought about in the petition. I mean, they're still trying to keep the industry going by switching. I mean, they did it to natural gas. They're trying to do it for hydrogen now.
Well, we don't discuss that. And, to the extent that fossil fuels can be used without the imposition of impacts on the environment or health, the petition would not regulate them. But the truth is that fossil fuels, as Jim has pointed out, and as Rick Heady has pointed out in his scholarship, are the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's difficult to conceive of having continued high utilization of fossil fuels especially for energy production, and because of the high cost of sequestration, the high cost, at least to date, of CO2 removal and of accelerated methane oxidation and those sorts of things. So, I don't know if how quickly that will change, but it seems that the best policy would be to prevent these emissions rather than to impose costs on future generations to deal with the mess that we've allowed to continue to happen. And of course, there has been some discussion about the so-called moral hazard of research into carbon removal technologies, that sort of thing. But that hazard, the hazard is that you'll allow industry to accelerate or amplify their greenwashing by saying, well, we're making investments here, for example, in carbon engineering or one or another major carbon removal research and development or field trial, or in the case of Climeworks or carbon engineering, they're actually doing some work in these, and be able to take credit for being environmentally sensitive, and therefore relieve pressure to force them to cease their emissions. But this moral hazard problem, if it exists, derives from the fact that there's no requirement to phase out fossil fuel emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions. So our petition, in fact, substantially resolves, at least with respect to policy in the United States, the moral hazard question.
Lisa, did you have a question or?
Well,
you-
no, sort of in typical fashion, I was going to make a statement.
Okay.
And that is that I heard this, the comment that if scientists have failed to make their case. You haven't failed to make your case. It's that the populace that was going to be convinced by data and science is pretty much convinced. And then you've got the whole rest of the country. So what this petition does and offers to me as a mental health professional, a doctor, and a person who looks at social psychology, a framework in which we can now bring the people who can change, those people who are essentially governed by a herd mentality, and they elect people who aren't knowledgeable about science, but by using a social psychology framework, a health framework, and a faith leader framework, which I think that this petition allows, we now have what is on the table for us to seize and run with. And that's what makes this so valuable to somebody like me.
Lisa, I hope you're right, but the thing I wanted to add, then I don't want this to get lost, is the fact that the agency looks at greenhouse gases, and everybody looks at greenhouse gases as sort of as fungible in terms of carbon equivalents. The agency also loves market solutions. So one of the things that they could do would be allow offsets, so that, for example, people could take natural methane emissions, like from bogs, and control those, or from other nitrous oxide emissions from natural sources, and deal with those and get credit for it. So it sort of opens up a wide array of things that you could do to combat this, and that would be included.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's technically right, although I think we are also highly concerned about fraudulent offsets.
Yeah.
And I just need to say that there's been a lot of manipulation on that issue, especially in the European trading system, but also in the California market system under the AB 32 implementation in California. I've been monitoring that somewhat, where people have gotten credits for doing things, or generated credits for doing things that they would have done otherwise. I believe that in our work with EPA during rulemaking and monitoring its implementation, we would be watchdogs with respect to that, with respect to the rules that might allow any offsets, whatever. And there would be I think a strong presumption in favor of actual emissions reductions, rather than, for example, rather than what you're talking about. But yeah, I agree. That's theoretically available, and I think that that comes into play as well when we're talking about what Jim was saying is needed, and that is to get beyond net zero and to actually get into CO2 negative equivalency of emissions. That is to say that there are more emissions that are being eliminated than that are continuing.
And I also think that a market-based solution, at least it seems to be a sound economic policy to me, to have producers and consumers pay the full cost of externalities in the products that we buy. We shouldn't be despoiling the regions where we get oil and gas. We shouldn't be despoiling the atmosphere without internalizing those costs as a proper market signal to use those resources more efficiently.
I mean, one other point that should be made, I think, for sure here, is that the virtue of this approach, or at least one of them, is that it avoids the present deadlock in Congress. People have been banging their heads against the wall because of the deadlock, a deadlock that, is, it's not an accident. The fossil fuel industry has been highly active and very effective. in ensuring that it has substantial allies in Congress. But here, Congress acted and strengthened the act in 2016. There is a tool available for its use, and we should utilize it, particularly where there is an administration headed by a person, this present president, that recognizes that we are confronting an existential risk, an existential threat. If there's no more questions, I want to extend our appreciation to you all at Climate Emergency Forum for hosting this press briefing, and we look forward to being able to receive the link to it. And I want to thank everybody who has participated, including all the petitioners, for getting on with us today. I see actually that we've been joined by Jim Baker as well. Hi, Jim. Thanks for joining. And we will persevere. So the next major thing that we will all be doing is gathering, or at least some of us gathering, to file this petition. That will be on June 16, and we'll be holding a press conference at 11 a.m. in Freedom Plaza, which is across the street from the Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you everyone for all of your great questions. We're really excited to hear what's going to happen on the 16th. And those of you watching will be sure to keep you apprised of all the latest developments. So thank you all for joining us.